And so we're calling in the report for a couple of things to happen there, Gary. Firstly, that the care inspectorate be given some kind of market oversight function. So we don't really have good intelligence about where is the money going. Secondly, that part of a new deal around commissioning and procuring social care support, including support in care homes, ought to be about ensuring transparency, making sure that standards of quality and safety are maintained, about really opening up to broader public scrutiny what's going on currently behind the scenes.
Just a final point to you. I mean, the Scottish Socialist Party say appointing an NCS chief executive and a handful of other well-paid chief operating officers will just be more bureaucracy and lead to no real change. Is that a danger here, that actually we set up, another quango which, pays people well but actually doesn't achieve its aims?
I think it's not if it's set up well and managed properly. And I think one of the things that we are stressing in our report is how important it will be for the governance of the National Care Service to be a partnership. We would like to see, for example, unpaid carers. You mentioned them earlier in your remarks. We would like to see them on the board of the National Care Service. We'd like to see people with lived experience of social care in senior positions in the National Care Service. I think if we go about it in that partnership, with that partnership mindset and an inclusive and engaging kind of way, we can interact some of those potential issues.
Derek Feely, thank you very much for your time this morning, author of that report into a National Care Service.
Sound there? Hello, good evening and welcome to tonight's online forum. I'm Callum Martin, your chair for this evening, which is the fourth in the series of online forums hosted by the Lothians branch of... A little bit of feedback there. Yes, the fourth in a series hosted by the Lothians branch of the Scottish Socialist Party, exploring the case for a national care service. Now, if you haven't seen them before, the first three are available online, where we are joined by a fantastic range of guests, including journalist Madeline Bunting. We've got a frequently asked questions video from Derek Feely, a whole range of experts, academics, trade unionists, and more. And tonight is no exception. We're joined by another fantastic panel of guests. We'll be hearing tonight from Dr Allyson Pollock, who's the director of the Institute of Health and Society at Newcastle University, as well as having been the head of public health policy unit at the University College London. We'll also be hearing from Neil Findlay, a Labour MSP for the Lothians. We'll be speaking as well to Trish McLaughlin, with over 20 years of frontline experience in the care sector, and also from Colin, SSP National Co-Spokesperson and former MSP for the Lothians. Now, since our last forum, we've had the publication of the independent review into adult social care, the Feely Review. Now, that report does recommend starting to create a national care service, but raises major questions that need followed up. For example, what does a national care service look like? Who should own the national care service? Should it be run for profit or for service? Who owns and operates the different portions of the service? That's exactly what we'll be continuing to look at in detail tonight. Now, in just a moment, I'll give each of our speakers a chance to offer their initial thoughts on that question. And then in the second part of the meeting, we'll have time for your questions from the audience. So do join our conversation tonight through the chat functions. Our tech team will be on hand to forward your questions to our panel to discuss in the second half. Before I do so, though, it is worth pausing to say that these forums don't just happen. These forums, the opinion polls, which we see covered in the BBC, and beyond, the campaigning of the SSP work, these efforts, these work don't just happen. All of this is the direct results of the efforts and dedications of donors, supporters, and activists. If you'd like to help, you can donate to the campaigning or join the Scottish Socialist Party online via the links our tech team will provide through the evening or via the website. Now, we start tonight by turning to our guest panel to start to look at that first question. So we'll start this evening with Dr Allyson Pollock. The Feely Review has come out. What's your first response? What's your first take?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for asking me. Well, in many ways, there are lots of very good things about this report, and we mustn't lose sight of them. But I, of course, would have liked to have seen it being much braver. So there's a lot of recognition in here about human rights, the needs of unpaid carers, the need for a national care service, and also, of course, making sure that the workforce have increased terms and conditions and training. But I think my own feeling is it's not bold enough. It would have been really good. It's a good start, but it needs to be a lot bolder. On the funding side, it's very good because it feels that social care should be free, but of course it doesn't address the whole issue of residential care. And of course, it's all very well having human rights as the framing, but what we've known throughout this pandemic is that human rights have really been thrown out of the window for relatives, residents, carers in the pandemic. So the right to family life, the right to visitors, the right to see your family has really been undermined in a major way. And so, of course, in the early stages was the right to good healthcare. And we know that because of the high number of deaths that took place in nursing homes and the fact that many people in nursing homes died and didn't get the access to the hospital care and the care that they needed. So the pandemic actually has shone a spotlight on the inadequacy of our care system, also on our health services. And so this is an important opportunity, but it needs to go much further. So my own view is that care is a continuum. It doesn't stop with the NHS and it doesn't start with social care. It's really a spectrum of care that goes on. And I feel that too about the workforce. While we have standards and terms and conditions in there, there's nothing here about nationalising the workforce and giving them really good terms and conditions and integrating that into NHS. What better training for young student nurses and young student doctors than working in domiciliary care and long-term care and really understanding the problems of older people, and yet that doesn't happen. So the nationalisation of the workforce is unaddressed, and of course the other big issue that's unaddressed is the whole issue of the fact that increasingly both domiciliary care, but especially residential care and nursing care, is delivered by large chains and large corporations where we cannot see where the money is going. So there are people in Scotland who are paying almost £2,000 a week because they can afford to pay for extraordinary care in nursing homes. And then there are, of course, those who are entirely dependent on means-tested care but will not be getting necessarily the same levels of care and provision because these homes cannot afford to staff them in the same way that people who are paying £2,000 a week can. Now, of course, the Feely Review has asked for greater transparency about where the money goes, and we really need open book accounting. But the whole issue of ownership and how services should be organised and provided and respond to needs remains completely unaddressed. So we're left with the current completely unsatisfactory, highly fragmented system of care, with a national care system being proposed that is mainly talking about funding, but is really doing nothing to have an imaginative vision for the future of care. So while there are lots of good aspects and nobody can quarrel with the many recommendations in this report, I would like to see this as the start of an effort towards major legislation, which is really about how do we have a properly run, publicly funded, publicly accountable and locally accountable systems of care that also extend to things like housing and housing support and sheltered housing, and consider both domiciliary care and residential care, and don't leave human rights outside the door when it comes to major pandemics like this. So I think I'll stop there because you've got lots of speakers and you've got lots of questions. But thanks for asking me.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Dr. Pollock. Am I correct in thinking that you're going to have to set off for another meeting shortly?
At 7:20, so I can sit and listen to another or take questions, whatever you would like me to do. Yeah.
Well, just in case we don't get a chance to say this later on, thank you so much for joining us tonight and for your contribution so far. This has been a really sort of fantastic series of forums we've had, and you've been a real help in bringing these fantastic range of perspectives together. I'm going to turn now to our next speaker with that same question. So this is going to be for Neil Findlay, Labour MSP for the Lothians. Neil, we've had to kind of the point that the Feely review sets out a starting point but doesn't go far enough. How would you respond to that?
It's important that we discuss these things in an open way, and I have to say, I looked through the report. I will concentrate my remarks on the care home sector and the home care sector, because that's what I know best, and that's what I've been involved in over the last year. I also would like to declare an interest in that. If I look out my window, I can see the room of my mum's care home bedroom, which is about 100 yards from my house. But yet, for the vast majority of the time that she's been in there over the last year, I've not been able to see her. And that to me, combined with the way in which people in care homes and indeed the home care sector have been treated during the pandemic, has been a human rights catastrophe. And if you look at the Equality and Human Rights Commission report into that, and indeed the Amnesty report into what went on in England, then you can see that human rights catastrophe, and it's very clear. And I actually think some of what is going on is, I think, criminal. And I think ministers and senior decision makers must be interviewed by the police during the inquiry that's going on by the Crown Office into the deaths in care homes. I think so. I just want to say that out for the beginning. Also, my wife and daughter both work in the NHS and are frontline care workers. I think, for the outset, I would say the system is very clearly broken. You could fill Hampden Park with the amount of reports that have been written in social care over the years. It's probably the only thing that exceeds the amount of reports on social care are the reports that have been written on health inequalities in Scotland. And yet still, these are two of the greatest issues affecting our country. The system as it is at the moment is exploitative, it's profit-based, and it makes money on the back of poor working conditions and the way in which people are meant to work within that sector. It is not, in my opinion, a care service. It is not a care service. We know that some of it is owned by small family companies, and some of them do a very good job, but some of them are owned by huge multinationals, and they are they show some of the worst aspects of business behaviour that you could ever imagine. We only need to look back to the collapse of the Southern Cross chain to see how that system is completely broken. The new owners of that chain, HC1, own 340 care homes with 22,000 beds. They paid 48.5 million in dividends and declared a loss every year. And they paid no UK corporation tax. They paid its highest executive 22.5 million and senior managers over 30 million. And at the same time, this company this month has advertised a wellbeing coordinator's post at £8.72 an hour. A senior care assistant, £8.87. God knows what the junior care assistant is getting. And home care workers, chefs, housekeepers, £8.72 and £8.82. And we have the audacity, ministers have the audacity to ask us to go and stand on the doorsteps and clap for carers whilst people are being treated like that. It's outrageous. If we look at the home care sector, I know people who were in my daughter's class at school who left to go and work in home care, working for private companies. They were getting sent all over West Lothian on 15-minute care visits, in, out, and a week's training in an office, and then sent out on their own with a client list to look after. And the second person this young girl went to was a man with a catheter in it, who had a catheter in. He didn't know what it was. She didn't know what it was, never mind being able to change it. And a couple of visits later, she went in to deal with a man who had a personality disorder and was abusive and threatening towards her. She didn't know what to do. And she was being paid £5.13 an hour. That is the system that is broken in this country. And if we look at the way in which we've known the system has been broken for many years, but the spotlight has been shone on it by COVID, and it's got more into the public domain. And it was only when that became a national embarrassment that we have seen change. And people started to realise how bad it was. In my own patch in the Lothians, HC1 owned the Red Mill Care Home, where we had, I think it was 17, the final death tally was in that home in Whitburn. And the astonishing thing was that the health authorities put in an incident management team to manage that, to advise the management of that home when people started dying. 3 weeks after an incident management team, the care inspectorate returned to inspect it and found that staffing levels were weak, infection control was weak, and well-being was weak, categorised as weak. The same categorisation as before the incident management team came in. What on earth was going on before the authorities were looking at that home if the categories were weak when they went in? It is unbelievable. And the HC1, of course, were the owners of the care home in Skye, and they have a litany of other problems at different care homes. We have this illusion in Scotland that somehow in Scotland we've managed the pandemic better than anywhere else. It is rubbish, utter rubbish. We have almost to the letter followed what the UK government has done, and that has been utterly disastrous. We've got some of the worst death rates in the world. And if we look at that human rights catastrophe of older people, denied hospital treatment when they should have been hospitalised, having DNR notices, do not resuscitate notices, put upon them without their knowledge or their family's knowledge, staff denied PPE, residents denied testing, and that madness of discharging people untested into the care home sector to allow the virus to run rife. And we have somehow managed the pandemic better than anywhere else. Well, if that's better, then I want no part of it. And we come to the Feely Review. I think there are some good things in it. There's a lot of good language in it. The section on employment rights is probably the strongest part in it. But that comes against the background of the unions and the care home owners. I was chair of the health committee in the Parliament, and I chaired a meeting where the care home owners, Scottish Care representing them, and the unions said we want collective bargaining. The next witness to the committee was Shona Robison, who was the health secretary, and I put it to her, we've got both sides of this sector, this industry, because they call it an industry, wanting collective bargaining. Why are we not introducing it? And her answer was, well, they've never asked me. I says, well, I'm asking you. Let's do it. Both sides want it, and it has not been done. I tried to move an amendment to the emergency COVID legislation to bring in collective bargaining in the care sector, and was told it's impossible. You cannot set up collective bargaining within a very short space of time. Well, if there's a political will, we could have done it. However, Feely does say some positive things about the workforce stuff, and long may that continue. But what this is not is a national care service. Let me be absolutely clear on that. And it is most certainly not a nationalised care service, because Feely makes the case against nationalisation. And I think that is a huge fundamental mistake that he is making. He is arguing for the continued provision of infrastructure in the care home sector and I think probably the home care sector through the private sector. They will own the buildings, they will run the buildings, and they will seek their 10% return or whatever it is. Alison can tell us what that percentage is, but I believe it's something like 10% return on their investment. And Findlay makes no moves to change that whatsoever. He sets out a lot of sort of positions that people have told him, the evidence he's taken, but there's no comment on or analysis of the problems within the system, the historic problems and the mistakes that have been made. There's no comment on whether the IGB system has worked or not worked, whether the cuts to council budgets have had an impact and whether that was a wrong move. There's no comment on the black hole in the NHS funding. And there's no attempt to address how we fund this and how we sustain this in the longer term. There's no price put on that. And so I think they've ducked the key issue around funding, and they've certainly completely ducked the issue on ownership. Indeed, they've counted out nationalisation, which I think is a bad move. They also lay a lot of stock in the teachings and thinkings of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, which is one of these American sort of guru type places that preach business and scientific management. And one Jason Leach is an adherent to the Institute, a man I have to say I am no fan of. But Derek Findlay was a senior person in that institute, and it very much is a kind of 1980s model of they're promoting that the minister will know best, the civil servants will know best, and they will put diktat out to the IGB, reformed IGB boards that will be devoid of local elected councillors. The new reforms that they are saying, there'll be councillors there as representatives, but that'll be reformed, and they won't have no direct democratic accountability. And of course, the key to all of this is resources. So where are the resources going to come from? What will happen if there's continued underfunding of the system? Why are we not looking at the care home sector and saying that we do want to take it back into public control? We can do it. It's very clear we can do it, and it can be done with, I think, saving money for the taxpayer. Because if you're paying 10% out to the care home sector at a time when interest rates are at 1%, then it doesn't take a mathematical genius to work out that you could do it and save money. And they put a lot of stock in the issue of delayed discharge, sorting out delayed discharge, resolving the problem. I know I've went over time already. I'll finish up now for others to come in. But what I would say is this is not a 1948 moment by any manner of means. This is not radical change the radical change that we need. There's no immediate pay rise for staff. There's good noises on collective bargaining and workforce issues. Nothing on sustainability. And if the future of the NHS was dependent on the private sector, there would be riots in the street. And yet this is what they're saying in relation to the social care sector. And by the way, do not think this is about other people. I'm looking at myself and Colin Fox in this that I can see in my screen. Colin, that'll be me and you debating in a care home in, well, let's hope a few years' time. That's our care. It's not just our mas and our grannies and our aunties and our grandas. It's us. So please take an interest that now is the time for a campaign for a genuine, publicly owned, publicly accountable, run in the interests of patients, national care service. This is not it.
Thank you, Neil. You continue to discuss that theme of what comes next after Findlay. How do we shape it? And I think some very, very important points there about the role of ownership and the cost and funding. All of this ties together. There's a number of questions actually coming up from the audience about these very topics, which we'll come to in a moment. We've got one or two more speakers. Now, first of all, our next speaker, we've got I think we've got one or two sort of slight technical things here. So we might not be able to see, but we should be able to hear from Trish McLaughlin, a care worker with 20 years in the sector. Trish, can we hear you?
I'm not sure. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you perfect. We can't see, but we can hear, which is the key to hear.
That's fine. Thank you for having me back. The Findlay report was quite a thing to work through. Like the other speakers have said, there's some really, really good points in there, but what it's describing isn't a national care service. The more help, the better for carers, for training and increased wages and improved conditions. And I should really say thank you for acknowledging that the pandemic brought things up that other carers we didn't ever think would have to face. I don't know if you can still hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hand gestures. I can't. But it's the more people talk about it, the more it's getting carers to lift their head up and listen to what other people are saying and hear about it. Aligning a national care service with the NHS seems to be the most complementary method. It seems to make sense to do that. And I'm still having kind of technical alerts down here, so I'm going to pass it over to somebody else for a minute.
Thank you, Trish. I think we'll hopefully bring you back in for some questions, then,
Yep.
Or if your tech, if the microphone kind of is up and running more fully in a few moments. While you're fixing that, though, and before we get to questions, I'm going to bring our next speaker. Just for timing, and then we'll come back to yourself during the questions in particular. But our next speaker, the last of our guest panel for tonight, is Colin. Colin Fox, National Co-Spokesperson of the Scottish Socialist Party and the former MSP for the Lothians. Colin, we'll be discussing his question tonight of Findlay reports come out. Here's what it says. Does it go far enough? A number of folk have brought up so far. Alison and Neil and Trish have all referred to this fact that it sets out a start, but does it go far enough, Colin?
Well, Callum, I think the Findlay report poses a question, and the question is posed by the Findlay report is, when is a national care service not a national care service? So that's what I want to try and touch on. Realise it's the same theme as my other three colleagues and guests in the panel are addressing. So I want to thank Neil, Alison and Trish for being here. I don't know if you can see it. This is the Findlay report, 109 pages. I read it last week. And I think the thing that strikes me and is worth remembering is that the Findlay report, Derek Findlay's review, was commissioned by the Scottish Government in September to review adult social care provision in Scotland after 2,000 people died in our residential care homes, which in Scotland was half the total at that stage, one of the biggest proportions in the entire world. So that's why Findlay was commissioned, and therefore we have to see his recommendations in that very, very serious light. Because the widespread public view, as Neil and Alison and Trish have already pointed out, is that residential care provision in Scotland is not fit for purpose. And it hasn't been fit for purpose for decades now. The present model is expensive, is provided, as Neil rightly points out, and nobody should forget, largely by private companies for profit. And it's a model that, frankly, the government are powerless to control. And on top of that, the quality is often poor. So Derek Findlay recommends, and if you've not got time to read the 109 pages, just cut to the last 9. Because the last 9 really cuts to the chase. And Derek Findlay recommends the establishment of a national care service, but virtually in name only. The establishment of a national care service, where he recommends that there's a care minister to sit in the cabinet next to the health minister. It recommends the appointment of a highly paid chief executive for that care service on the same salary as the chief executive of the NHS, which he used to be. It recommends the appointment of 6 chief operating officers, also on handsome salaries. And that's it. That's it. Nothing about it should be free at the point of need. Nothing about it should be publicly owned and run. Nothing about this is a service that, instead of being a national scandal and an embarrassment to the people of Scotland, should in fact be a world leader and something that we are the envy of the world about. It's nothing to say about the fundamental feelings of the population of Scotland. And at the centre of this debate, and other speakers have rightly touched on it, there's an ideological choice here between public service or private profit. And Derek Feely, to be fair, he's aware of the public's concern in this matter. On page 75 of his report, he says, and I quote, "We share the unease expressed by many in Scotland committed to healthcare free at the point of need, that our residential care system is largely run on a profit-making basis." Yet, on the one hand, he freely accepts the public unease. On the other hand, he rejects it out of hand. In effect, Derek Feely's conclusion report is the public want and need a national care service, but they can't have one. That's what the Feely report tells you. It's not free, it's not public, and it's not fit for purpose. And as people would know, maybe I can fill Neil in about this, the last forum that we had coincided a week or two ago with a panel-based opinion poll that the Scottish Socialist Party commissioned, which we wanted to test public opinion, because our feeling was we've been campaigning for this in the streets of the Lothians, Glasgow, Stirling, elsewhere for the last 10 months. And our conviction was that the overwhelming majority of the population agree with myself and Neil that this should be free, this should be publicly owned, this should be fit for the 21st century. So we commissioned panel-based to commission a scientific test of public opinion. And the week before last, they came out and they found that 69% of the population of Scotland want precisely that. They want a national care service. They want it to be free like the NHS. They want it to be publicly owned and run, perhaps better than the NHS. But we'll leave that for a minute. And they want it, above all, to be fit for the 21st century, because the provision just now, quite frankly, isn't. And Neil and Alison and Trish have already pointed out, it's not just the Red Mills care home in East Whitburn that Neil can see from his window, or the Home Farm HC1 care home in Portree in Isle of Skye that was closed down and taken off of it because the circumstances were so miserable. It's now in public ownership, owned by NHS Highland. The truth of the matter is the Care Inspectorate in Scotland conducted a surprise audit in October of care homes that they picked at random across the country and found that 40% of them were either inadequate or poor in a surprise inspection. And that's because that's probably a fair statistical sample to take of anywhere. So 3,000 people in Scotland have now died of coronavirus. I don't know if people seen this report last week. This is a BBC report. 10 people died in Lochgelly just in the last couple of weeks. 10 more people. So you're talking about 3,000 people have died in Scotland from coronavirus in 10 months' time. So the circumstances we're in this is, quite frankly, a national scandal. And I'm afraid to say, Feely doesn't go anywhere near it. It runs away from it. Feely is a big fearty. That's the truth of the matter. When the Care Inspectorate have said it. And, you know, there's a asset to this debate that you can access. I accessed it the other day. The King's Fund, which is a think tank that most MSPs like Neil would see their work from time to time. Well, they produced on their website a catalogue of royal commissions, reviews, white papers, acts and bills over the last 25 years, going back to Tony Blair's time, when he started 25 years ago saying this is a system no fit for purpose that lets down working class people, senior citizens all across Britain on a daily basis. The sad reality is of 25 years of Feely reports that have not done a single thing, and the positions got worse and worse and worse. And I have to say that the public point of view on this is absolutely clear. They know what they want, and they're determined to have it. And the Scottish Socialist Party, I have to say, I'm proud that the last 10 months, the work the Scottish Socialist Party has done in exposing the inadequacies of residential care, as other speakers have said, this didn't start with COVID. This has been 20, 30 years in the making, this scandal. And the Scottish Socialist Party in the last 10 months have had hundreds of street stalls across Scotland, petitioning the public to support a national care service, free, public and fit. We've been out leafleting door to door, canvassing public opinion, writing letters to Nicola Sturgeon, Jean Freeman, Richard Leonard, Boris Johnson. We've been out postering, writing letters to the national press, holding forums like this one, commission door opinion poll, appeared on TV and radio, discussed with academics like Alison and frontline staff like Trish, and have also made it absolutely clear that we know what the public's point of view here is. And we are confident that the public recognise a national care service free at the point of need, publicly owned and run, fit for the 21st century, is an idea whose time has come. And hopefully in a minute, Callum, I'll give some time if somebody asks me about it, what a national care service would cost. But I would want to finish these introductory remarks by focusing on what is it that other political parties are arguing. So, for example, what does the SNP say about this? What does the SNP say about a national care service? And to this point, the SNP's position is that they want to merely amalgamate the 31 existing health and social care partnerships into one. That's it. That's their national care service. A bureaucratic quango on a par probably that's even probably less than Derek Feely's. They don't support a national care service free at the point of need, publicly owned or fit for the 21st century. Who says so? Jean Freeman, no less, the health minister, last week at the CARE gathering, who said the Scottish Government does not support public ownership and does not foresee the public sector taking on social care responsibilities in Scotland. My view is that the private providers add real value. I do not support a nationalised care service run by the state because I can happily work with private providers. Now, that's what the SNP's health secretary said last week. There is, of course, a debate in the Parliament. Neil, I hope, will participate in the 16th, which is a week, is next Tuesday. And we can fully expect to see the SNP reiterate that position. The question at issue is, are they going to accept that they can have a national care service with the great limitations of Feely, or are they going to simply put that on the pile along with the rest of the reports that they've had, them and others, over the last 25 years? And I happen to think that's probably an open question, because they might be attracted to set up this national care service that's not worthy of the name. Their trouble is that if you do, then you've got a very clear locus for all the discontent that will continue to exist by all the people in care homes across Scotland who've not once seen one iota of change with that reform. And that's a great danger for them. So the Scottish Socialist Party is proud to stand in the same tradition that Nicola Sturgeon talked about on the 1st of September in her programme for government. Well, she reminded us, I'm glad she did remind us, she reminded us that the National Health Service was set up in 1948. In a period similar to this, a great crisis following the Second World War. And the whole atmosphere of the public's mood was, we want something that's completely changed for the way things are. This has got to have been about something. And we've got to leave a proper legacy of a national care service free, publicly owned and fit for purpose. Now, those words will come back to haunt Nicola Sturgeon if next Tuesday she makes it clear that the SNP government are not going to introduce a national care service along those lines, but settle for something far, far less. So I look forward to the questions that people have got in the chat room. And I thank again Neil and Alison and Tricia for their remarks in this debate.
Thank you, Colin. And thank you to each of our guest speakers, our panel tonight, for your opening remarks, your initial responses to that question. The Feely reviews come out. What next? In a moment, we're gonna start with Trish and then Neil and Colin, bring in some questions from the audience. Before that, though, just 2 points. First of all, a reminder that tonight is an interactive conversation. I see in the comment sections on Facebook and on YouTube, there's lots of questions coming in. Do continue to send in your questions. If questions come to you afterwards, you can obviously find us on the social media. You can use the hashtag as well, hashtag National Care Service, or tweet to the various branches of the Scottish Socialist Party, or Colin or Neil or other folk who are in this meeting tonight. I'm sure we'll be happy to answer your questions. You'll also have a wee reminder there that tonight's conversation, tonight's forum hasn't just come out of nowhere. This is part of an ongoing campaign to bring about the reform, to see the real national care service we all need delivered. Now, if you want to get involved, there's lots of ways you can do that, but I can think of no finer way than to donate to or join the Scottish Socialist Party. You'll have a fantastic chance to help fund and get involved, organising and campaigning, promoting forums like these, the campaigning that Colin's alluded to, packs for MSPs, information packs for folk who are interested, campaigning in the street, campaign online. So this is a fantastic opportunity to get involved and really kind of have your voice heard in Scotland's democracy. Now, on the subject of having your voice heard, there's lots of questions coming in tonight. So that's what we're going to turn to just now. So there's quite a few different questions coming up, quite a lot of recurring themes. We're going to start with Trish, since we weren't able, there was a slight technical problem bringing in before, so we'll start with Trish. So there's a question which has come a few times, which I think, if I can ask yourself, is, from your perspective, as someone working in the care sector, there's obviously this point that Feely review is a starting point. It doesn't go hugely far in solving a lot of these issues. But from your perspective, what kind of difference do you think public ownership could make compared to what kind of what we have now, or compared to even to what the Feely review sets out? If we can start with that question there, Trish.
Well, to start with that, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
That's fine, because it's telling me here I'm muted at this end. To start with that, from my point of view, working for a private company means that the company can be sold. And that's came up just before I started with the company I'm with now. I know that they did try and sell it, and it was investors that wanted to buy it. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right, that's fine. What I would like to be, by being a public service rather than a private service, it would mean that we wouldn't have to do training depending on who we worked for. The training would be the same level across the board. It would be like a recognised career path. If I want to go and work for another company, I then have to do their own training, as well as the fact that I have a national recognised qualification. And it's all the little silly things that, if you've got people that work in care, will know. Things like standardised procedures, knowing that it's not an individual that's deciding how much money has been spent every day on residents' food, that's something that's been set in stone. It's all the little niggles, and to be honest, when you sit down and start thinking about it, and because I have been pretty stressed tonight with this computer, it would just be better for the industry to be seen as a good industry to work in. It would change the perception, and people are using that word industry. I tend to use the word sector, but it would help people pursue. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, you got me. It would help people pursue a career path that would be as easily recognised as one if they went into the NHS. And at the moment, that's not there. There's multiple training providers. There's not really a continuity in what the jobs ask for. And there would just be that wee bit of more security for staff as well. And I'm getting all kind of alerts down here on my laptop, sorry.
That's quite. We can hear you. You can hear you, grand. Do we have connection?
I'm just about hearing you and no more.
Fantastic. Well, we'll leave it just for a moment then, just to see if we can sort of tech side of thing there. In the meantime, we'll keep things going. So thank you, Trish, for the answer there and your contributions tonight. Hopefully, we have time for another question before we end. Just next up, though, another question, though, which has been coming up quite a bit. I think this is one perhaps Neil might want to respond to, which is, that the Feely report, it's made its recommendations. This debate will obviously be going to the Scottish Parliament to be considered very shortly. So, there's obviously different party positions in this. I think Colin, yourself have both referenced Jean Freeman's comments on kind of how she sees care, reform proceeding. Obviously, kind of there's different perspectives, kind of in the different parties. How would you see, how do you think that debate will play out in the Parliament at the next stage? And what role do you think kind of different parties might have in shaping that?
Well, I think we'll see the usual approach from the Scottish Government, which is rhetoric over reality. So they'll present this, and already have tried to shape the narrative on this, as they say, and calling this a national care service when it's not. And you'll hear lots of claims that this is what we're creating, and that, you know, there'll be lots of dramatic language that this is, you know, the 1948 moment and all that bollocks, which is what we'll get. And from the Tories, they'll probably, as we would expect, be want to ensure that the private interests are respected within any settlement, and that the money keeps coming in. They'll be lobbied heavily by, as the government will, by Scottish Care and others to ensure that happens. I couldn't tell you what the Liberals will say. Ourselves and the Greens. Well, I was on a call actually today with Richard Leonard about this very issue, and we spoke at length about the Findlay report. And if anything, his position is even more robust than mine. But unfortunately, he's not the leader anymore. He absolutely was savage about the report, and he's read it in depth. You know, we are having a leadership contest again at the moment. I know Monica Lennon has played a huge role in us holding the government to account on the care homes issue, and I think she would pretty much be in line with where I am on this. I have no idea where Anas Sarwar will be in it. I don't know, but I think if I was speaking of the feeling that I have within my own group, then it's very much. I think most people would fall behind the kind of approach that I'm taking, that this is not a national care service, that issues around ownership are not addressed, and ultimately this is about driving up standards, both for residents, both for people who get home care of whatever sort, and for the people who work in it. And Trish is absolutely right. What this has to be, and you know, we've heard this time and again, this has to be about creating a system where people want to go and work in it. Where we don't have, I'll give you an example. I spoke to a group of Unite the Union reps working in social care a few years back, and they came to me, and this was at the peak of local government cuts, and we're seeing more cuts this year again, or a negligible increase. They came and said that they had been told they worked for a charitable organisation who was contracted to a big council in Scotland. They put in their tender for the year, for 2 years, whatever it was, to get the work. They were phoned up by whoever was the officer dealing with tender, and says, look, you got 15 quid an hour or 14 quid an hour per person last year. You ain't going to get that this year, so you'll have to cut your price. So they cut their price to, let's say it was 13 quid an hour. Now, that's not the worker who gets 13 quid an hour, that's the company. But they cut their price. Their boss came in and said, you know, crack the champagne. We've won the contract. You've got a job. Oh, but by the way, you're on year 6 of a pay freeze. You're working an extra hour a week. And you'll have to work more unsociable hours. Now, that was their reward for them winning a contract, which was basically driving local government cuts, driving down standards and driving down workers' wages and conditions, and people celebrating the fact, you know, I used to hear every year people cheering as the budget was passed, cheering cuts to local government, cheering cuts to social care, cheering cuts to education. You know, I want no part of that, absolutely no part of that. But if I think that's what we'll see play out, and they'll make the argument that nationalisation is unaffordable, as Findlay does. Findlay makes the case against nationalisation. There's a section in it that makes the case against nationalisation, when actually we could save money by nationalising these services, particularly at this time, because we have an opportunity with low interest rates and the way the economy is, to make this work to our advantage. And I've seen some of the stuff that's come out recently from Commonweal, which I think is really interesting, on social care. Nick Kemp, who wrote the paper, has done a terrific piece of work there, talking about the possibility where you could actually offer people bonds to put in their money, to government bonds, to purchase the care home sector and give them a return of 3%. which is far more than any of them will get in the bank at the moment, but their money would be used for some social good rather than the government having to borrow at market rates or anybody else having to borrow at market rates. So I think there are innovative ways, not using private finance in the traditional private finance way, but using it to finance government bonds with a small return. That could be done in a completely different way than let's get the private sector to run it and take their 10%.
Fantastic, thank you, Neil. Which I think actually leads quite nicely and quite neatly to another question that's come up quite a few times tonight. This question of exactly that, funding. We've talked about, the case for it being publicly held, publicly run versus, driven for profit. So, Colin, if I can ask yourself this one, there's a number of comments coming. So, a number of folk have touched on the fact that, if it's costing many people £50,000, £60,000 a year, surely kind of, funding this through tax would probably be less to many individual taxpayers than paying it up front. Other questions have come up, though, in terms of how do we fund this, especially without the full tax powers of devolution? How do we bring this all together? There's a number of questions here to address. So Colin, how would you say that a publicly owned free point of delivery one could be achievably funded within the Scottish Government's and the Scottish Parliament's remit?
Well, Colin, what an intelligent bunch of contributors you have this evening, because that's a $64 million question, isn't it? The Scottish Socialist Party gets asked this all the time. I'm sure Neil and those other colleagues who support a free, publicly owned and fit for the 21st century service get asked it a lot, and it's right that we get asked it, and it's right that we have the answers to it. Two things I'd say in context. First of all, I'm sorry Trish keeps getting interrupted online, but one of the points I'm sure she would make is Feely recommends an increase to £9.50 an hour, something called the real living wage, whatever that is. And he suggests that would cost £15.5 million to raise people's wages from the £8 and £7 that Neil was mentioning earlier on. And we're bound to remind people in this debate right across the country, it's not just the wages been terrible and the conditions been terrible. And as Neil rightly mentions, that in effect, HC1, Four Seasons, Bupa and the rest of them are anti-union employers. They're anti-union employers who dominate this industry. And as if that's no bad enough, one of the questions I sent there to Trish was she mentioned at the last forum, in this sector, and given these figures we've just mentioned there, it's perhaps not surprising that a third of all care workers wrap it every year. They walk, they've had enough. They go to work in a supermarket for better wages. They go. And so one of the big issues this model fails on is the terrible turnover. There's a shocking level of turnover in this sector. People barely last a year. A third of them don't last a year. So in that regard, Trish McLaughlin's somewhat of a celebrity because she's been in this work for 20 years, and well done for her, because it's really important work. Perhaps she'll get a chance to elaborate those in a second. But on the finances, of course, the key to this question is understanding. And the understanding, I dug out some of the figures that Feely and also the Social Work Commission contributed to this debate. So, for example, Scotland spends £3.8 billion a year on social care. 3.8 billion. 2/3 of that is spent on social care provision for older people. So that's 2.6 of 3.8 billion. And 84% of that elderly care provision comes from the public purse. 84% of it. So in other words, if you've got a arithmetic O-level that I've got, and presumably Neil has, you work out that only 16% of the money comes from the private sector. In other words, what they call self-funders only contribute £380 million. It seems a lot, but against a background of 2.6 billion, it's not very much. And of course, that's perfectly logical when you think about it, because as you said, Callum, if it can cost £100,000 a year for residential care, it stands to reason there's no many people in East Whitburn can afford that, or the Inch, or 90% of Scotland. So that sum of money that the self-funders contribute is very small. It costs £36,000 a year for a local authority to look after somebody in residential care. So without bamboozling people with figures, because we've got to cut to the chase of what would it cost for a national care service free at the point of need, publicly run, owned and run, fit for the 21st century. And it would cost to bring care workers up to £12 an hour living wage, which the SSP supports, and to make sure there's enough of them, and to cater for future demand based on demographic trends, it'll cost the country another £500 million a year on top of the wages bill that's there. And on top of that, if you're talking about providing a service that's fit for purpose, then you need one that's a damn sight better than the one we've got. And that will cost another £300 million for extra provision, improvement facilities, improvement of treatment, etc. And of course, you've also got the charges and the self-funding money that you don't get from people who pay privately. So it comes to about £1.5 billion extra. But then you have to deduct how much money does the private sector take out this industry every year. And this is where the figures start to get really difficult, because HC1, as you know, aren't based in Edinburgh or Britain. They're based in the Cayman Islands. So it's very difficult to find out how much money these private companies are making in profit. And as a former chartered accountant myself, I can let you into a tip. Whenever they're rather coy about it, it means they're making a fortune and they don't want you to know about it. And the best estimates I've seen that in Scotland, it's nearly £500 million in profit from the private care sector in Scotland. That's how much they're getting. So you can deduct that for the £1.5 billion. So without wishing to bamboozle people with figures, I realise there's a lot in this, Callum. I'd refer you to a story in today's BBC. And what does it talk about? It talks about the Royal Hospital for Sick Children here at Little France, where I live. A PFI, an SNP PFI, would you believe, that says that the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People, which should have cost £150 million to build and a full price tag, is costing £432 million by HSL, the private company that owns it. And so all the money that the SNP, and I'm sorry to say to Neil, the Labour privatisations for the last 20 years that Tony Blair initiated, because sitting right next, as Neil knows, to the Royal Hospital for Sick Children, private hospital, is the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, private hospital, that the Labour Party privatised along with the other hospitals and schools and bridges and prisons, including the one at Addywell near where Neil stays. In other words, all the money for this National Care Service could be recovered easily tomorrow if we renegotiated the PFI contracts and all the thievery of all these shysters like Macquarie in Sydney, Australia, who own the Royal Hospital for Sick Kids, and we got the money back that these people have been thieving from us. You could pay for a National Care Service 10 times over. That's the answer to the debate. And I have to say, the key question, Neil put his finger on it, this is about standing up to private ownership and to telling private owners that this public want to see this publicly owned, and there is no place for profiteering in the NHS or the care service. And I'm nowhere near as confident as Neil. That's why I'm not in the Labour Party that either Anis Sarwar or Keir Starmer or Tony Blair will do any such thing.
Could I maybe add in a couple of things there? I think that's, important. I think, in many of these issues and many other issues, I don't think there's much between Colin and I on them. I've never apologised once for Labour policy on PFI, because I never believed in it. Never once believed in it, and argued all the time against it. Indeed, when I stood for Labour leader, I announced a policy that I would bring in to buy back the PFI contract. And by the way, it can be done, and it can be done to our advantage, freeing up huge amounts of resource. And particularly, again, I would say, it's so obvious that you do that at a time of low interest rates. Why would you not do it? Why would we be paying out 10, 12% profit to privateers at a time when you've got 1%? The markets will give you 1%, never mind anything else. So why would we not do that? And indeed, there's two examples in the northeast of England where that was done on relatively small projects that were bought back into public ownership and freed up significant millions and millions of pounds of money. And I have to say, actually, if you're going to look for an example in Scotland where that is being pursued vigorously in North Ayrshire Council under the leadership of Joe Colin, who is an absolute breath of fresh air in local government, who's involved in the community wealth building project and setting up public renewables schemes, and was one of the first to introduce free period products, is building council houses on a big scale again, and has changed the terms and conditions of the workers in North Ayrshire for the better. They are looking at buyback of PFI contracts there. It is a completely different approach, a radical approach in local government that has been much missing for years.
So I'm just going to have to come in. We are looking to move up to time, I'm afraid. But I think thank you for that point. There's some fantastic points, and actually a lot more to say about PFI. I think this is one of these topics that we could really sort of unpack with a forum of its own in a way. So thank you. But I'm afraid I am going to have to start moving us to the end of tonight's meeting. We are approaching the end. So in just a moment, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of our speakers, Neil, Trish, and Colin, for one last. If they could give us a one sentence, one last thing they'd like to say in this particular conversation ahead of that parliamentary debate. So I'll give you a moment just to think about your one short sentence, Neil, Trish, and then Colin. But just to say while they're thinking, just to say thank you everyone at home for all your questions for now. Obviously, there's quite a few more questions been coming in, a lot of points and topics that have come up from our speakers tonight that we don't really have full time tonight to sort of tear apart, get into the nuts and bolts of. But I would just say thank you for all your questions that have come in so far. Do keep sending them in online as well between now and the next forum. Our next forum will be in the aftermath, the follow-on, continuing on from after that parliamentary debate. So kind of any questions you might have between then and now, do hang on to, be prepared to bring them along to the next forum, or better yet, bring them along by joining the Scottish Socialist Party. I'm going to turn now, just before we start to close up, with one last short sentence from each of our speakers. We'll hear from Neil, then Trish, then Colin. One last sentence to this conversation before we wrap up.
Sorry, you're going to get two. One last, on this issue, this is the moment. This is the moment, and it won't come round again for some time. So we have to ensure that we have a national campaign that brings different groups together to campaign for a properly publicly owned, publicly accountable service. Now, my final point, and I'm saying this openly to comrades, I am looking at some of the commentary as we're speaking, and the easiest thing is for people to attack history or attack my party or me, and the easiest thing for me to do would come on and attack you. In this issue, this will get us nowhere, because we need the left to be unified on this. We need the left to come together and say, this is what we're going to do. Because if we don't, and we all splinter into our different wee camps and start lobbing boulders at each other, I'll tell you what will happen. We'll have a privately run, privately organised care service, and we'll all be wondering how it happened.
Thank you, Neil. An appeal there to seize the moment, bring together that broadest sweep possible behind this issue. Trish, a final sentence ahead of the next stage of this conversation.
Well, from Neil's broad sweep to a very, very specific one, any private care worker watching or listening needs to join a union, and they need to share this conversation and other conversations that are going on about this subject as far and wide as they can, because as Neil said, this is the time for it. And as many folk need to share it as possible. There's a lot out there to grab people's attention, and it just needs to be shared now.
Fantastic, thank you, Trish. And Colin, one final sentence.
The thing I'd say, I agree with the theme that Neil's presenting there. I'm not under any illusions about the scale of the opposition to this idea. And by that, I don't mean Anna Sarwar or Keir Starmer. I'm talking about the private companies who own this industry and are not about to give it up. So I'm not under any illusions about the battle we have. And in that regard, Neil can take assurance from me that the Scottish Socialist Party will join with anybody and everybody else that's in favour of a national care service free at the point of need, publicly owned and fit for the 21st century. In that regard, I suspect, like Neil, I believe this is an idea whose time has come. I'm confident that this is an idea that's overwhelmingly intellectually rigorous, and the population in Scotland have long been and have demonstrated it repeatedly year after year after year, much more inclined to public ownership than anything being private and run for profit. And that's the essence of our case. So I look forward to working with Neil. I think I'd say to this, Callum, there's a debate in the Parliament next Tuesday. So following that, there should be SSP National Care Service Forum number 5. And then after that one, we should talk rigorously, take up Neil's theme and talk turkey, nuts and bolts about establishing in Scotland a genuine cross-party, everybody involved campaign for a national care service free at the point of need, publicly owned and run, and fit for the 21st century for Neil's generation and mine to come and everybody else that comes behind us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you once again to all our guest speakers tonight. Thank you to Neil Findlay, MSP, to Trish McLaughlin, to Colin, and to Dr. Pollock, to Dr. Allyson Pollock. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, for answering our questions, joining that conversation, sharing your thoughts on how we take this forward. I'd like also to say thank you to our tech team who've been working away, bringing in your questions, keeping this all running along. It's a fantastic job done in very difficult circumstances of lockdown. Making these meetings possible is a huge task that's been done fantastically well. And thank you as well to everyone who's tuned in tonight, everyone who's asked your questions, everyone who's gotten involved in this conversation. And just to finish up by saying that this will be brought before Parliament in the coming weeks. So remember that there's still time to get involved in this conversation. There'll be more forums to follow. There'll be potentially a campaign coming up as well, in the broadest sense as well. But in the meantime, a reminder, you can also donate to the campaign. You can join the Scottish Socialist Party as well online. So just to finish off by saying thank you once again to all our speakers, to our tech team, for everyone who's tuned in. I've been Callum Martin. Thanks for watching and good night.